Welcome to our first DC Talk of the year. My name is Christine Minato, and I'm the director of the UCSF Rosamond Institute. Before I start today, I'd like to let you know a few exciting programs that we plan for 2022. As you might have seen or heard, is that our application for the RISE program is now open. The RISE program offers entrepreneurs specialized mentorship, networking opportunities, and a community of fellow innovators, founders. And these selected entrepreneurs will gain access to 3 months of one-on-one interaction with experienced mentors from our network and beyond. Areas of expertise will include, but not limited to, communication, legal matters, business strategy, funding, investment, market access, market development. And we strongly believe that mentorship and supportive communities are essential to a growing company, and that by leveraging our community, we can provide you with the resources you need to succeed. So do apply by February 9 at the rosamondinstitute.org. Those are the information that you can find it at the rosamondinstitute.org. And also, I want to get your attention that we just launched a new program called Startup Operations Support. This is a resource hub that connects early stage health tech entrepreneurs with our partners, offering a range of services and support. And you can learn more by visiting our website, rosamondinstitute.org/resources. And with that, I want to introduce you to our speaker today. We have Sabrina Varanelli, the founder and CEO of Nemedio. She's going to tell us about everything in pre-compliance. As you know, our industry is regulated, and how can we use stage-appropriate compliance to accelerate your medical device development? Sabrina is an experienced robotic engineer specializing in developing medical and surgical robotic systems. She holds dual undergraduate degrees in robotic and mechanical engineering. Before specializing in medical space, she worked on robotic systems in different industries, including defense, bomb disposal, infrastructure, and the oil and gas industry. Her experiences in the medical space led her to found Nemedio to solve the unique challenges that medical device companies like yours face when bringing new product to market. So Sabrina will take questions along the way. Please post your question in the Q&A box down at the link or the button in your Zoom below there, and we'll take the question in between her talk. So with that, Sabrina.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine, for the intro. Let me share my screen here and we can get going. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right. As Christine mentioned, my background is in medical and surgical robotics. And, throughout my career working on these products, I was always just shocked at how difficult it was to do, this cutting edge, innovative robotics engineering in this space that had so much red tape. And so one of my personal and professional goals is to essentially demystify the regulatory approval process and the compliance process, particularly when it comes to engineering teams or people who are not coming from the medical device space. Usually medical device is treated as this kind of, black box of compliance, and, you have to be kind of an expert and, know a lot in order to, even touch it. And one of the things we're trying to do through, workshops like this is to make it more accessible so that people can do what we call phase appropriate compliance activities. So the objective today is to kind of help you make sense of the medical device development process and to essentially teach you some activities that you can be doing while you're in R&D mode, maybe even before you're ready for full-blown compliance, in order to make your product development process easier when you're ready to transition to fully compliant operations with red tape. So with that, let's get started. So as this is a very difficult space that you've chosen to build a product in. Commercializing new med tech is really expensive, it's slow, and it's very difficult. There is hope, but at the end of the day, it's just a very hard space to be in. On average, an electromechanical device that uses, electronics and circuitry and things like that, it'll take around 6.5 years and $31 million to get to market. And, we believe that this is needlessly expensive. And so as a result, we kind of do these talks and everything to educate people so that you're not wasting money and you're not running up your timeline and your money as you're trying to commercialize your product. So, just know that this is a hard space to be in, but with some introductory knowledge and, by being smart and optimizing your engineering process, you definitely can, make it to market with a lower budget than what most people end up spending. So when it comes to the biggest challenge that people face, arguably from an engineering perspective, you're like, yeah, it's difficult, but at least that's something you kind of know what you're, you know your domain. You might be a medical professional, you might be an engineer. You're very good at what you know how to do from that perspective. Most people struggle when it comes to, compliance and regulations. What regulations do you have to follow? How do you actually comply with them? How do you comply with them in a way that doesn't slow you down too much? These are the big questions that people need answered. And I think it's really important that we go back to the root. Why do these regulations exist in the first place? What is the purpose of following all this stuff? Why do we have all this red tape? And when we start understanding, logically why these rules exist, it allows us to, follow them in a much more efficient way. So this is kind of, the first lesson that I want everyone to take away with. These regulations exist effectively to protect the consumer. So it's to protect the people who are buying your medical device. It's to protect the people who are, ultimately the end users of your product, or, that the product is being used on. You essentially as a company can't lie to the customer. You can't say, I have a miracle drug that, cures cancer and not have evidence to back up that your device is safe and that it works. And so, an example I like to give is I actually, at our company, I actually collect old medical equipment and old medical bottles and labels and boxes, because I find it really interesting. Before the FDA imposed all these rules, companies could just go out and say whatever they wanted about their products. And I have a clipping from a 1918 newspaper here that a company is essentially selling snake oil. And they're saying, the snake oil comes and it acts upon pain as water acts upon fire. It puts your pain out completely and permanently, which obviously is impossible. You can't, knock out pain perfectly with, a drop of snake oil. But these companies back in the day would, push these miracle products onto people. And the idea behind this regulatory agency and the idea behind all these rules that we have to follow is to essentially protect consumers from companies making claims about products that, the product can't actually do. So this is the most important thing, foundationally for us to remember as we go through, is why these regulations exist. So zooming out to the medical device development process, what usually happens and what people think is the best way of, bringing their product to market is usually they'll, raise a little bit of money at the beginning as a company or a startup. You have some funding, maybe you have a grant, maybe you're spinning out a technology from university. And for the first couple of years of the program's life, you're focusing all of your effort on engineering and product development. You say to yourselves, I'm not ready for compliance. I don't need to worry about this stuff. That's something I'm just going to hire a compliance person for later. And they're going to, tell me what to do and everything's going to be fine. They're going to check all the boxes, do all the documentation. I'm the engineer. I'm just going to, focus on my academic research to get this product built as a prototype and, work with the doctor to make it work. This is probably the biggest mistake that we see companies making, because what happens is you hire this first compliance person, and what they'll do is they'll take a look at your prototype and they'll say, did you realize you forgot to follow the safety standard? You need to ground this electrical signal. You can't just go in and, have all these labels here and, the labels don't make sense. And, if you spray water on them, they're going to come off. So there's lots of regulations that impact your engineering design. And if you wait too late to consider them, you end up with what you consider a finished prototype that you then have to go and redo engineering on. You have to rework it. You have to rebuild your circuit boards. You have to go in and rewrite your software because you didn't comply with the regulations as you were building the product. The important thing to remember is regulations are not just testing the finished product to make sure everything works. The FDA and other agencies in the world require that while you're building your product, you're doing adequate documentation. And so it's really important that you don't start compliance too late, because it ends up forcing you to redo your engineering work. And we see lots and lots of early stage companies that run out of cash. They raise some money and then they run out because they can't get investors to give them more money, because they have to go in back and redo all this engineering work before they can even, show FDA their product and, go for a clinical study and things like this. So, this is the traditional pathway that most people think is appropriate. but I'm here to tell you this is not the way that we recommend going about your product development lifecycle. You really should be considering some of your compliance stuff early on. Now, this doesn't mean you should consider all compliance, because compliance does slow things down. But what we do recommend is while you're in your earliest stages, you should be doing something called what we call pre-compliance. So it's the activities that you do before you think you're ready for compliance. And the idea behind them is they are the subset of regulations that help you engineer the right product the first time. So effectively, what you're doing is you're doing the bare minimum, training wheels type of compliance activities that you as the engineering team are qualified to do on your own without hiring, lots of expensive people to do. You as the engineers and, the founding team and the medical professionals, the people who are inventing the technology, you can do this stuff early on in order to get yourselves started on, the path to compliance. You don't have to, wait to do everything all at once. You should be getting started on it earlier, because again, what it does is it allows you to have a smooth transition and not fall into this pit of having to redo work where your company will run out of money and you might not be able to find investors to support you during that time. So what we're going to cover today is what those specific activities are that you should be thinking about during pre-compliance and how to go about actually doing some of this documentation yourself. So we're going to dive into pre-compliance. So I'm going to kick us off here with a diagram, and we call this diagram the Nemedio method. It's our engineering approach to the pre-compliance activities. These activities represent a small subset. They're the training wheels activities that you need to do for the much bigger diagram that we have, which is full-blown compliance activities. So these are the baby steps versions of getting yourself up and running with compliance and compliant activities. So the first one that we're going to talk about is this box here called the indications for use. And so, as a team, what you're building at this point. And there's this document that you're going to have to build called the intended use and the indications for use document. And it effectively, tells the regulatory agencies what your product is used for and when your product gets used. And, you probably can sit and write this document. This device is intended for use in patients with colorectal cancer. And it's a surgical robot to remove the portion of the colon that's infected with the polyp or the surgical cancer. This product is not intended for use for people who have had prior surgeries. So the intended use and the indications for use are, the compass, the roadmap of what you're actually building your product to treat. And, while you might hire somebody later on who's a regulatory expert in order to tailor this to make sure it's actually written perfectly before you submit it to the FDA, you as a company should be aligning and starting a draft of this document, essentially describing what your product is used for and also when your product should not be used. This is a concept called contraindications. And, it's kind of the thing, if you ever read the side of an Advil bottle, it says, take 2 pills and, it helps with headache and nausea and all this type of stuff, but don't take if you're pregnant or expecting to become pregnant. Those are, examples, real life examples of indications for use and intended use. And this is one of the first things that you can be documenting. Okay, so going back to our diagram here, we're going to jump over to this side of the diagram before the picture becomes complete. We have our indications for use taken care of. We're moving over to the device description and the system architecture. So again, these should feel easy and straightforward because they kind of are. That's the idea, is that if you start documenting these now, it's going to save you a lot of headache later when someone a little bit more experienced in compliance comes in and goes to clean them up for you. So the second thing you should be documenting, second and third things, are your device description and your system architecture. This is probably going to be the easiest part for you to do. You basically describe your product in pretty detailed engineering terms. So for example, the device is comprised of 3 parts. We have part A that does XYZ, part B does, XYZ, part C, and they're connected together via coupling. So, when you're writing your device description, you should give it as much detail as you can, given where you are in the design and development process. And you should be writing it in such a way that a reasonably educated engineer in your field could come in and basically pick it up and maybe call it their onboarding document. So it should be able to describe the stuff in technical detail. Something that a lot of people don't understand is that FDA does have, biomedical engineers and doctors and medical professionals on the team of people reviewing your product. And one of the things that they will want when you interface with them is a very detailed device description so they can visualize the product in their mind. Later on, you can include pictures and everything here, but it's not necessary. Documenting at least the bare minimum of what you have is going to be critical in, setting yourself up for success later. Something you should be considering also during this, which usually gets pushed way too far down the line, are things like packaging, sterilization. So, how do you clean the product? How do you sterilize it? Do you put it in, ETO, ethylene oxide sterilization, which gets really hot and could melt some plastic pieces? Do you, autoclave it with superheat and, also could melt some stuff? This type of stuff, again, you can imagine if you don't start thinking about it early, you might design your piece with a certain type of plastic that is not, biocompatible. If it touches someone's skin for too long, or if it gets implanted in the body, it might, cause irritation or cause cytotoxicity and kill off the cells. So these are things that you should be considering early on. And so when you write your device description, the stuff starts coming to light, and it starts, helping you as a team understand what type of product you're building, and if you're building the right product for your prototyping stage that's going to actually be able to go through the FDA process without having to do re-engineering activities. You also should not forget your software. So one of the other big documents that we recommend you have is a system architecture, which should include software and hardware for electrical components as well. So system architecture might be a block diagram. So we have this piece, and we have this web app that interfaces with this piece through Bluetooth, and it has this web server, and it has these 5 pieces internally, mechanically, that connect to each other. We have a wire over here, and you have like a nice high-level system architecture. What you would draw on a whiteboard describing your product to somebody else. These are very, again, they seem straightforward and something that you as an engineering team could do quite easily, and that's the point. Document it down, and then from there, we're going to, derive additional things that come from that initial set of documentation. So again, we started with our indications for use. We moved on to the device description and system architecture. This is the easy stuff. We're going to keep going and keep building on that. Questions so far? Oh,
Yep,
I see one. I see one, Christine. Should we start off with the DFMEA? I will talk about the DFMEA when we get to the risk, these red boxes over here. So let's come back to that one. Awesome. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to this next chunk. So now that you've written your indications for use and your device description, your system architecture, we recommend starting on what we call the regulatory strategy plan. This should actually, like in reality, since you're trying to do stuff in parallel and not waste time by doing everything one right after another, I actually recommend you do this at the same time as doing all this other activity. So the regulatory strategy plan is essentially your overall compliance plan. What is our path towards regulatory approval? And it should include things that we're going to talk about, your device classification. So how does FDA or other regulatory agencies abroad, how do they classify your device from a risk perspective? What is the actual approval I'm going to get? i.e., what that really means is like, what are the laws that you need to follow in order to get your device approved? This depends on a lot of different factors, the type of device you have, how risky it is, this type of stuff. Your regulatory strategy plan should also include relevant standards, guidance documents, and regulations, and what plans you have to meet with the FDA, which we'll talk about in a minute. The idea behind this regulatory strategy plan is that it should not just be, here's all the stuff we have to do. You should also be taking into account things like funding milestones. So, for example, we plan, so I think one of my classic examples is often companies will go and they'll say, okay, we have a product that we're building. Let's say it's a wearable for home monitoring of blood pressure or something like that. Maybe you want your product to be used with both adults and children. It's a lot easier to get something through the FDA for adults than it is for children. You all can see this with the COVID vaccine, right? The adults got it first, and then they had to do more testing on the children. This is a pretty common theme with FDA stuff. So when you're planning your regulatory strategy, you might say, okay, well, I have enough funding right now to do maybe X number of people in a clinical study. If I want to do pediatric populations also, I'm now going to have to double my budget. So maybe I want to just go for a 510K or a regulatory approval with adults, and then, get more investor money once I get that, and then go for, pediatric populations as well. So there is this marriage that occurs between your regulatory strategy and your overall, fundraising strategy as a startup, as a company, getting a foothold. And so it's really critical that as you're considering this regulatory stuff, you also layer it on top of this backdrop of investment and when you're going to be raising money and what milestones you need to prove to your investors that you know what you're talking about. This is one thing we recommend. The other thing that I do recommend is that you can try to do some initial research. This is probably the only thing that I'm going to suggest during this time where you really want somebody who's experienced helping you with this. This is not the kind of thing you want to mess up. Maybe you do some research on your own and then maybe confirm it with somebody who's very experienced in the space. But the regulatory strategy plan is the foundation for all of the activities you'll do later. And if you mess something up at this phase, it's really hard to go back and fix it. So really recommend that you take this one very seriously. And if you're spending resources on something, this is the area where you do want some expert support, to just come in and support your team in developing this regulatory strategy. That being said, it's critical that you as a company, hiring somebody outside, need to understand some basic information so that when you get this plan, you actually know what to do with it. So we're going to talk about the first thing here is this concept of device classification. And, I have my picture of Megan Trainor here. It's all about the risk is, when it comes to device classification. So FDA and these other regulatory agencies internationally, they differentiate between different risk levels of device. So this is how dangerous the product is in the sense that, if something goes wrong, how hurt can someone end up? It's divided into 3 classes usually. In the US, it's class 1, 2, and 3, where 1 is the lowest risk, 3 is the highest risk. And, class 2 is usually what 80% of the products end up falling under, which is moderate to high risk. So as some examples, so class 1 products include things like, bedpans, gloves, Band-Aids, stethoscopes. Class 2 products have a really wide range. Anything from like feeding tubes to surgical robots to tampons, glucose testing devices and monitoring devices. These usually broadly fall under the category of moderate to high risk class 2. Class 3 products, if you have an implantable product or a product that's in the body, you're most likely automatically a class 3. But if you're building something that is high risk and has a high likelihood that it could, kill or dismember somebody as a result of malfunction, you're looking at a class 3 high risk product. So keep this in mind. So these are the device classes. Let's put that aside for a minute. The next thing to consider is the regulatory pathway. So the device classification allows you to select a regulatory pathway. It's not the only thing that lets you select a regulatory pathway, but it's one of the factors that helps you determine which type of legal documents you need to submit to the FDA in order to get your clearance. And again, just as a side note, I keep talking about the FDA, but Europe, Canada, China, all the markets are more or less very similar in this regard. The terminology might be a little bit different in terms of the actual legal numbers and laws and everything, but for the most part, the world is pretty harmonized on risk levels and things like this. So just a side note, if you're planning to submit in other countries, this stuff does apply broadly. It might have a little bit different terminology. So going back to the regulatory pathway, you may have also heard this word pre-market submission. It's essentially all the documentation that you submit to the FDA, demonstrating that your device is safe and that it's effective, that it actually works. Again, we go back to our first slide up here with the snake oil. What are we trying to do with this submission? We're trying to prove to the government that you as a company are selling something that is safe for use and that does what you're marketing it to do. That is the whole purpose here. And again, the way that you do this is called a regulatory pathway. Now there's 3 major regulatory pathways. There's a lot of other random ones that are not so common, but these are the 3 primary ones. And to be completely honest, most 80% of products fall under this first one, which is called a 510K. And essentially the idea behind a 510K is you're making an argument to the government that your product is at least as safe and effective as something else that they've already cleared. So you're kind of pointing to that product, which is called the predicate device, and you're saying, our product is substantially equivalent to that one that you already gave permission to sell. Therefore, I'm going to, prove that my device is still safe. And here's all my documentation. There's a lot of stuff. There's like a big checklist. This is the whole point of compliance, is to generate all this documentation that you need to submit your 510K. So that is one regulatory pathway. This is the easiest one. This is the one you should be trying to aim for. One of the Actually, I'll come back to that. But this is the one that, most products fall under this, and this is the one you should be aiming for. The second one is called de novo. And this product is the approval. So it grants pre-market notification, meaning you're allowed to sell it for low or moderate products. So class 1 and some class 2 products. There's more clinical data required to get your device submitted under de novo because there's no product on the market that is similar to your product that you can point to and say, hey, their device is safe, so my device is safe as well. So that's the second one. That's the de novo. More data required. It's a lot harder to get. Takes a lot longer. There's a third one called a PMA, and this is the one used for class 3 products. Tons and tons of clinical data required. This takes a really long time. If you can strategically avoid doing a PMA or de novo, you should, again, back to the regulatory strategy plan. Describe your risk and figure out which one of these you fall under, because some of them are, much more expensive and take a lot longer than others. So this is, part of the strategic aspect of things. Looks like we have a couple of questions here. Okay, we have a question. So the question here is, what type of trial do you need to prove equivalency? So it's less about a single trial proving equivalency. There's lots of different types of testing that you do. So when we get to the last slide here, there's this testing called verification and validation testing. And FDA, this is like actually, I'm going to blow the lid off of what everybody thinks about the FDA. FDA is not going to tell you what type of testing you need to do. You should never expect to knock on FDA's door and say, hey, FDA, I'm building this type of device. How do I test it in order for you to give me my clearance? The whole purpose of these regulatory pathways and these submissions is to essentially use the scientific method. So, hypothesis testing data to prove to FDA that your product is safe and effective. So you're essentially, like, you can imagine you're going in front of a judge and you have to state your case. Here's my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that my device is safe for removal of colon tumors from humans. Here's the clinical evidence showing that it is safe. And here are the 5 products that you have approved in the past that do similar things to my product, and you said that they are safe. And my testing, is similar to their types of testing. So it really depends on the device that you select as this predicate device for 510K in order to show, what show the type of testing you need to, get your clearance. So it's not cut and dry. I do this one type of clinical study. I do a human clinical study. I do an animal study. I do a cadaver study. It really depends on your particular case. And the whole point of your application and the whole point of all this stuff that we're going to go through here is to build up your argument. It's to build up your case of what to do. So I think we have a couple more questions here. Christine, I'm just going to dive into these. So do we classify passive recording devices that have electronics in them as class 1 or 2, passive EEG? Okay. So again, it has to do with risk levels. And off the top of my head, I happen to know that these types of devices are class 2, the EEG devices. Again, this is don't take anything I say as gospel, but 95% sure that this particular EEG device would be a class 2 product. Whether or not something has electronics in it does not have any impact on its risk. Okay, something can have electronics and be class 1. It can be class 2. It could be class 3. Whether or not you have electronics and software does determine if you're a class 1 device. It determines extra documentation regulations you need to follow. But whether or not you have software has no bearing on device classification. I talked about how the predicates fit into regulatory strategy. The question here is how do predicates fit into regulatory strategy? Predicates are a component of crafting your 510K documentation and argument. Again, you basically say, hey, FDA, you've cleared these products. My product is very similar to them. We're going to build up this regulatory submission that uses this as an example and points to it in various ways. Another question here is, if there's a predicate device that is hardware, but your software is different and novel, can you still use a 510K? Okay, so one thing I want to clarify with predicates. Predicates are less about technical aspects of your design and more about your indications for use. So you can have let me think of an example here. You can have a surgical robot. Actually, okay, here's a good example. The first surgical robots that got their clearance, they have software, they're electronic, they're super, complicated. Their predicate was actually a traditional laparoscopic tool. So, the tool that has like the little handle and people do surgery, it's like a stick, and they stick the robot, they stick the little stick inside of you, and it has like pinchers on the end so the surgeon can go in and do the surgery. That was the predicate used for the original Da Vinci surgical robots. Technology wise, they are completely different, right? One of them has no electronics, no software, it's only hardware, it's like a glorified pair of scissors. The other one is a giant robot. They were able to use the predicate because it has less to do about your technology and more to do with the medical indication that you're using your product for. So to answer the question, if there's a predicate device but the software is different, you still might be able to use the 510K because again, it's more about the intended use. Technology does play a role, but it's less of a role than the intended use of your product in choosing your predicate. I hope that clarifies that. Oh, we have a good question here. What about the EUA? So I actually used to have a slide in here about the EUA, but I took it away because all signs are pointing to EUA being revoked at any time now in the next couple of months. The EUA is technically a regulatory pathway. It is a very shaky regulatory pathway. Over the last 2 years, I've worked on a lot of EUAs. They essentially allow you to shortcut some of these regulations. The structure is very similar of what you have to submit. You still have to submit some clinical data, et cetera, et cetera. But EUA, yes, is one of the regulatory pathways that you are able to use to get your device not cleared, not approved. It's not official. It's authorized for use only under the emergency settings. So as soon as the EUA gets revoked, which the industry expects it to be revoked in the next few months, all of the companies that have EUAs, they're currently being required to show to FDA that they have a pathway to clearance through one of these methods. Otherwise, FDA is going to say you can't sell your product anymore if you don't have a plan to put it through one of these. So again, the EUA is something that's used, once in my entire lifetime. So like right now, it's only used in extreme situations and can be taken away at any time. And you have to kind of take that into account strategically from a business perspective. But yes, it is a regulatory pathway. All right, let's see. Okay. All right, so I think that's all the questions we have so far. So moving on here. Actually, yes, I got all the questions. Okay. All right, moving on here. So we have the next box that we're going to cover here is this box over here that stems from the indications for use. So the indications for use, we basically said, here's what I'm going to build. I'm going to build a surgical robot in order to, remove, this is my favorite example because it's kind of a complicated surgical robot. It's a fun one. So we're going to build a surgical robot. It's going to do a colon resection. It's going to remove portions of the colon laparoscopically that are infected with cancer or polyps or something. Now, what you as a company need to go do next is develop a set of user needs that allow your product to meet that indications for use and intended use. Now, if you're a software person, user needs are very familiar to you. They are essentially, a Jira story that you might create. But essentially, you take a hard look at your product and you list out who are the users of your product. So users is a broad term. It could be anybody involved with your product: doctors, nurses, attendings, people who are sterilizing your product at a hospital, a caregiver, a patient, the patient's, the person watching the patient in the ICU. So you should be documenting all the people who will interact with your product, and you consider them as stakeholders. And using their voice, you essentially come up with a bunch of statements as a user. And what you say in your head is, in order to perform the device's intended use, I need the device to XYZ. So these should be high level, these should be broad, these should not be technical in nature. So as a user, I need to be able to, roll the robot into the operating room to do my surgery. As the user, I need the robot to have hand controllers so that I can drive it. As the user, I need the robot to have dual display screens so I can view my diagnostic information on one screen and my camera display on the other screen. As the user, I need the system to be able to display, camera images from these 5 models of camera. So you essentially go through, and again, from the perspective of each one of these stakeholders you've identified, you craft lots and lots of statements, user needs statements for what they need the device to do. This might seem silly. FDA will actually require you to submit this when you give them their information. They will audit this documentation. This is something that they expect you to do during your design process. This is why you should be starting it while you're prototyping, not when it's too late. This is stuff that impacts your engineering design. So these are the user needs that you should be looking at. All right, we have 2 additional questions before I go on. Humanitarian device exemption. So that is a very complicated thing. It's not technically a regulatory pathway. It's more of a way for individual hospital IRBs to allow use of their product, allow use of an experimental product in their hospital. It has nothing to do with actually allowing you as a company to sell your product on the market. It has to do with, IRB testing and clinical testing inside of a hospital, which is it's kind of separate. So it's not one that I would consider on the traditional regulatory pathway. If that's something you're interested in, it is very complicated. Definitely talk to somebody who knows what they're doing. All right, I have a question on cybersecurity. I'm going to give a brief chat about software in particular at the bottom of this talk. So cybersecurity is a massive topic, and it falls under the category of risk analysis, which we're going to talk about shortly. So it should be considered as one of the major risks of using your product, is that somebody could go in and attack it. You must mitigate these risks. So we'll get to that a little bit later. Let's see, some of these questions are a little bit specific. Someone is asking, shouldn't you start with the user needs before defining the intended use? Because it might seem, putting the cart before the horse, filling out the user needs to support the intended use. So the reason I like to do it in this order is because you probably as a company are not starting this process. If you were starting this process perfectly, before you even have the idea to build the product, you would have written down your indications for use and intended use. So if you are already building a product, you've already started building a product for a reason. So, write down that reason first. But in theory, all of these documents are getting updated cyclically. It's not like you finish one and you're never going to look at it again. The idea is that you're going to come back to these documents. So, because it's the first thing that everything stems from, you should write it down first. And then, your user needs come from there. All right. Okay, so moving on here. There's some more questions, but I think some of them I'm going to hold until we get to a more appropriate section of the talk. Okay, all right, so moving on, we have requirements. So here you've seen the diagram. Indications for use are a broad document. We stem from that a list of user needs. And what FDA does require is that for every single user need, you have to show that you engineered the product to meet that user need. And the way that you show this is by specifying a requirement, an engineering requirement that describes how you built your product to satisfy the user's needs. So the way that you write this, again, it becomes a list. In order to meet the user's needs, what physical characteristics from an engineering perspective must my device have? And these should be written out. There's a lot of, you get really good at writing these. When you actually start working with an expert in this, they will take your list and they will, streamline it. But the way that you guys can be writing them right now is by a simple sentence: the product shall XYZ. So, from my user need before, I was saying, as a user, I need a device to have 2 screens. You might derive a requirement from that. And again, these should be derived. This is why this arrow is here. You derive your requirements from your user needs. They are linked together. And in fact, you are required to demonstrate to FDA that there's this thing called a trace matrix. You're required to demonstrate that there is a actual database connection between these 2 things. The product, if the user needs it to have 2 screens to display this different type of information, your requirements might be the product shall display data in a format of HDMI from the following types of cameras. The product shall have a monitor with size 11 by 17. The product shall have a monitor with a display of, high definition 1080 pixels. So you're actually taking the user's needs and actually deriving them one step further in order to state the engineering requirements that you must have in order to, build the physical product. And there are lots of different requirement types, but the ones that we have listed here are the ones you can really start with. They're functional requirements. They're requirements for performance. So like you might have latency. So let's say you have a camera system, you say, the latency shall be no greater than 50 milliseconds. Otherwise, there's lag in the system and you can't use the surgical robot properly. You might have safety requirements, which again, we're going to derive from things like risks and risk mitigations in order to make sure the device is safe. Usability, so the font must be legible from 10 feet away because the surgeon might be looking at the screen from 10 feet away. You'll also have requirements that are directly derived from regulations. You'll have requirements with interfaces. So this might be, the HDMI example I gave. There's some marketing requirements, you must use the shade of blue. You should also be including those. But the requirements should be essentially a comprehensive list of everything that you're building into the product. And again, you are not only required to document it, you're required to demonstrate that the requirements have a one-to-one, well, at least one-to-one relationship with user needs. So every user need must have at least one requirement, and every requirement must have at least one user need upstream of it. And you're required to demonstrate that relationship for your documentation. All right, let's see. There are questions that make sense to answer right now. Okay, all right, we'll hold the rest then for the end. Okay. All right, so the next stage that we're going to go into here are, I didn't mention this before. So before I was talking about these statutory regulatory requirements, there are these things called standard documents. So remember, when you're doing your regulatory analysis, one of the things you should be doing is identifying all of the standards that you have to follow. So here's an example of one. ISO 60601-1 is a whole series of standards that you have to follow in order to demonstrate general and electrical safety of your product. So those will turn into requirements. So it's really important that you do your regulatory analysis early, and you should know what those actually end up being. Okay. All right, so moving on here. Okay, so the next chunk we're going to go into, the second to last chunk here, is this section on the DSC report and risk notes. So these red boxes represent a very big concept called risk management in medical device. There is an entire standard. And when I say a standard, standards are not laws. They're internationally accepted ways of doing things. So basically, FDA doesn't say you must follow 14971, but if you don't follow 14971 standard, you're being dumb, and you should follow it. Everybody in the industry follows it. Nobody tries to do this without following the 14971 standard. This standard is for risk management, and it is very intense. It's very complicated. And while you're doing your prototyping, you should not be trying to do full-blown 14971. It's kind of a waste of resources unless you have, all a lot of funding and, a big enough team that you have full-time quality engineers who can help you with this. This is a very difficult thing to do properly all the way. What we recommend instead during pre-compliance is to use a set of questions that we call a device safety characteristics report. And we can, provide information on where to find those questions as a follow-up when you get the recording here. But there's a set of, around 45 questions that we recommend companies answer in order to get your mind rolling on the types of bad things that can happen. So the risks associated with using your product. So that is one of the ways to get started. And while you're in pre-compliance, this is the first thing we recommend you do, fill out the answers to these questions. Then what you want to do is derive risk notes based on these answers to these questions. You'll sit and you'll look at your product and say, here are all the ways that my product can hurt somebody. The thing that I want to be clear about is just because you write something about how risky your product is, it doesn't mean that FDA is not going to let you sell your product. Your goal here is to write down every single possible bad thing that can happen using your device within this, within the scope of reasonable misuse. So if someone's like deliberately using it wrong, then we're not going to worry about that. But if somebody could reasonably misunderstand using your product, this is a risk to your device. And so as an engineer, you have general engineering intuition about what risk is. You're building something, you're in CAD, you're designing, something in SolidWorks. You're like, oh, if this piece breaks, it's going to cause this other thing to break. And then, the whole robot arm is going to go crazy. and it's going to come off its track and it's going to, stab somebody because it has a sharp scissor on the end or a scalpel. You as the engineer already are thinking about these types of things. And so what's critical is for you to just simply start writing them down and to write them in this format of, a very obvious risk. So when it comes to later on, when you're doing full-blown 14971 stuff, the methodology that you'll use will take a risk, which, again, we as humans know how to describe risk. If you have so I'm from New York, we have radiators in a lot of our buildings here, especially now when there's snow. And, when you have a radiator, someone could get burned, right? The risk of a radiator is getting burned due to touching the exposed radiator fins that are hot. That is a risk that is easy to write. When you go in and actually do full-blown 14971 compliance, you're not only required to write that risk, you're required to go backwards and decompose it into chunks that are referred to as the harm, the hazard, and the hazardous situation. So this is why this type of risk analysis gets really difficult. So what we recommend you just do right now is to simply write out the risk in plain English. What is the risk? The risk is if this piece breaks, the robot arm is going to get off its track and it's going to, stab somebody in the colon and it's going to puncture their colon. That's bad. And so you should be keeping track of these as risk notes. Then what you want to do is you want to take those risk notes and you want to mitigate the risks. You want to take the risks and you want to say, here's how I'm going to make sure that that risk doesn't happen. And so the way that it's easy to do this during pre-compliance is to derive a requirement. So my requirement is that, this particular piece shall be no less than 1 inch thick, because that mitigates the risk that that piece breaks and causes the bad thing to happen. Again, risk management is a very complicated topic. These are the training wheel approach, pre-compliance approach to risk management activities that we recommend during this early stage of your product development. All right, I'm gonna go quickly through these last slides and then we're gonna hit all the questions at the end. Okay, so the next thing here, let's summarize. We have our indications for use. From there, we derive our user needs. We have our requirements, and the requirements have a lot of inputs. They have inputs from risks that are being mitigated. They have inputs from standards. They have all sorts of inputs. Now, we mentioned clinical trials before. At the end of the day, you're required to test your product. You have to make sure it works. And when it comes to testing, there's two types of testing. And it's usually referred to as V and V testing. It's verification testing and validation testing. We had to make it confusing and use V's for both of them. So the first type of testing is verification testing. This testing tests to make sure your device does what you say it does as a company. So you as a company say, here are my requirements. Here's what my product is subject to. Here's what it does. You must have a test for every single one of those requirements. One test can test multiple things if it covers that, but you're required to show that there's a test for all of your requirements. There's another type of test, and when people say clinical studies, this is what they mean. It's a type of validation testing. Does the device do what the user needs it to do? So, the user needs to be able to have colon surgery, right? The system needs to be able to remove cancerous polyps from someone's abdomen. And you devise clinical related validation tests in order to validate that your product meets its intended use and the user needs of the system. Again, there must be a one-to-one relationship. You must be able to demonstrate that for every one of these, you can trace it up to you can trace it down to a test. Again, remember, if you're talking about clinical studies, a clinical study is one of the many types of validation studies that you'll do. During pre-compliance, so writing these full-blown verification validation protocols, it's a lot of work. It's going to take you a lot of time. You probably don't need to deal with it during pre-compliance. What we recommend instead is devising something called the test protocol note, which essentially is this concept of, it's a summary. It's a couple of sentences describing how you think you're going to do your major tests on the system and tracing the major ones to the requirements and the user needs that you are deriving. So you might have a test protocol note for a clinical study, and it might satisfy 20 of your user needs. It might satisfy almost all of them. You might also have a human factors study, which satisfies, some ISO 62366 human factors types of validation studies that you need to do in order to satisfy the requirements. So V&V testing is a big deal. During pre-compliance, you should be summarizing and tracing. That way, again, you can make sure that you're actually planning and budgeting for the right number of tests to build your product. So the last thing that I want to talk about here is once you've done all of this work and you have a, let's not say a version 1, let's say like a version 2 or 3 of all of these documentations, you want to actually go and talk to the FDA. And the FDA, you're allowed to go and talk to them. You should go and talk to them. If you are not prepared, you should definitely not talk to them, because you can shoot yourself in the foot by, you can scare the FDA and then they'll tell you you need to do more testing and stuff. But there's this thing called a pre-IND meeting, or usually for a 510K, it's called the pre-submission meeting. And one of the things we really recommend is that this be one of your major milestones you hit before you go out and fundraise for a Series A. So usually we recommend doing all of these activities when you're in like a seed stage as your medical device company. And then, you do your pre-submission meeting and then go out and raise a Series A, because what you can go and do at that point is you can say, hey, FDA looked at all of our, low-level risks. They looked at our low-level test protocol notes. They looked at all of our stuff, and they agree that our clinical study needs to be, 100 patients, and, we need to do a cadaver test with 5 cadavers, and we need to do a pig study with 3 pigs. They agree that that clinical testing will be sufficient to clear our device. Then you can go and very confidently go out to your investors and say, we have a plan. FDA agrees with our plan. If we follow this plan, I need $20 million to get to market. And they'll be very confident in their ability to give you that money and to have you actually use that money to get to market. Something that I really want you to understand when it comes to pre-sub meetings is, especially now, this time frame is usually 3 months to get one on the books. Now with COVID, it's taking longer, especially if you're a diagnostic device. It's taking, they're delaying them up to 120 days at this point. So just know that if you're using this as one of your milestones, you need to start planning ahead, because it does take a long time to submit your documentation and to get answers from FDA about, asking questions and things like that. So the key takeaways I want you to walk away from this presentation with are that, yes, compliance is hard. There's a reason why this is a whole industry. It's regulated. It's very difficult. But we want you to kind of start understanding that it's not that you can't do anything about it. You should start as early as possible. And again, I hope this presentation informed you into some of the activities that you can actually get started on immediately in order to de-risk your product development, so you don't have to redo your product later on. So what you should be doing is documenting what you're able to as an engineering team, as a team that maybe doesn't have all this expert support yet. Document what you can during engineering. It's going to make your life a lot easier later. You should also expect everything to take a lot longer and to be much more expensive than you actually think. If you have a budget in mind for getting to FDA, if you're like, yeah, I'm going to get through FDA clearance for $5 million and it's going to be done in a year and a half, 18 months, you are absolutely wrong. And you should at least double that number before, before thinking that you can get through your regulatory submission with small amounts of resources. This is a very expensive and time-consuming process. It's also important that you confirm your plans with FDA. Let's imagine that you think your product is a 510K. This happens a lot. People come and they're like, yeah, my product's a 510K. We go to FDA, we have, they go to the FDA, they have a pre-sub meeting. FDA is like, no, your product's actually de novo. And now they have all sorts of extra work that they have to do because they thought they were only a 510K. So confirm this stuff early, and you can actually go back and talk to FDA more than once. Should definitely use them as a resource, but again, only go into the meeting if you're prepared. The last thing I'm going to say is, there was a couple of questions on software. Don't underestimate the difficulty of software. If you have started writing software and you don't have compliance implemented, you're probably going to have to rewrite a lot of it. Software is extremely difficult from a regulatory perspective. And in fact, I'm actually working with Christine and the team to set up a second session of this kind, overviewing software for medical devices and software as a medical device, and how you can do similar pre-compliance activities to make your software easier. But essentially, there's like extra stuff that we're going to add onto this diagram that you have to do if you're building a product that has software. It makes it much more complicated. Don't underestimate it. So with that, thank you for coming to this talk. I know we're at time here, but Christine, I can stay on and answer the remainder of these questions. I think we have about 8 in the queue here. Ballpark cost. Ballpark costs on things are not something that I can just give. So someone's asking if I can give a ballpark cost on regulatory pathways for digital health applications. it significantly depends on all of this stuff. And in general, when it comes to ballpark costs, do not expect to be able to get an accurate ballpark cost on anything unless you've done all of this work. Okay. What I can tell you that it's not going to, you're definitely going to need more than $3 to $5 million. But in terms of getting like, decently accurate ballpark costs, the whole reason of doing all this stuff early and confirming with FDA is to help you get to those ballpark costs. It's not something that like somebody can just say, because everybody's pathway is different depending on their product. We have a question here of how much work is a de novo pathway compared to a 510K pathway? Yeah, there's definitely, so there's a higher fee, which is mentioned. And the review timeline, usually for FDA review timelines, it's 3 90-day review cycles. I don't actually know the de novo timelines off the top of my head, but it's that or longer. And again, right now, everything's taking a lot longer, so you can expect it to be longer. The primary difference between these two, de novo and 510K, is not related to regulatory submissions. It's related to audits. In addition to the paperwork that you hand to FDA, FDA will audit you. They will come to your facility. They will come to your manufacturing facility. They will look at your documentation. And in addition to the stuff that you submit to them, they will ask to see all of your other notes that you did, your design history file, all of this stuff that you were doing. They will audit it and make sure it's okay. With a de novo, they must audit you before they will allow you to sell your product. With a 510K, they will audit you after. So, it takes time to schedule the audit. So it's not that it's, it's a lot of, de novo is a lot of extra work. It's a lot of extra time to review it. And then on top of that, it's a lot of extra time to get an audit before you can even start selling. So if you're doing a de novo, your timelines are, very far.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you, Sabrina. Thanks for your time, and looking forward for our next talk.
Yeah, and if I didn't get to your question, if you want to send an email to info@nemedio.com, I can, send you an email answer. There were some questions in here that were good that I didn't get a chance to get to. So if I missed your question, please email us. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.